but it hurts to brave. The life I have isn't what I'd seen. The sky's not blue and the field's not green.
It took me probably 3 years of teaching this subject full-time to understand how accountability fits into the bigger picture of what HOP is. And so in the time that we have together, I'm hoping I can share some of that information so that it's helpful. Because for sure, sometimes when people hear about the subject of HOP, their first thought is that we're preaching anarchy and that there are no rules and that accountability doesn't apply. And so I want to help maybe adjust that thought or give different words to describe what HOP looks like and what accountability looks like. I'm guessing that most people have seen these basic tenets or beliefs on what HOP is. If you haven't, feel free to take a look at them on the screen. The ideas around HOP is that people make mistakes. Right? Humans were fallible. There's a limit to our capacity to take in information. We're always going to be making errors. There's going to be mental models that we have that are inaccurate. So we accept that that's true. And then we also accept that blame doesn't fix any of that. It doesn't make humans less human. And certainly the environment or the context we're in, the tools we have, the tools we don't have, the information we have, the information we don't have, that all drives our behavior. And it's important to learn about. And so learning and improving becomes vital. And the only way that we're able to put all those pieces together is in how we respond as leaders. But when you start looking at the ideas of people make mistakes and blame doesn't fix anything, it very quickly calls into question the idea of accountability. Because in all of our industries, there are real rules that if they're not followed, there are real consequences. There's people's lives can be at stake. Very terrible things can happen. And so the idea that we're not going to blame anybody kind of also makes it feel like, well, but what do we do when people just don't follow the rules? What are we supposed to do in this space? And I had to go through that thought process and that mental transformation and being able to understand how accountability fit into my world. And I don't know any better way of describing it except for telling a story. So I'd love to tell you the story of me trying to piece together what accountability looks like. And I want to tell you what I did do in real life, in this real event, real story, and then what I wished I would have done if I understood more about HOP and accountability at this point in time. And then hopefully I can give a few more words or different words to describe how accountability and HOP fit together. But first, story time. I'll do story time. To do that, I'm going to draw a picture, and I'm not a good artist. So you can take a guess as to what I'm trying to draw. A lot of people think this might be chairs. Then I add this in and it feels like perhaps it's toilets. If you're not alone if you think it might be toilets. It sort of makes it feel more like I might be drawing toilets when I add people in, but it's not toilets. It's supposed to represent two very large buildings. So in my world, I came from originally GE and GE Aviation at the time. And we had very large buildings that we would test jet engines in. So the things that look like chairs, they're supposed to represent big buildings. And then the thing that looks like a toilet is actually supposed to represent an engine, a jet engine. Because after you put together a jet engine, you have to put it into a building and hook it up to high temperature, high pressure equipment in order to run a test to make sure that the engine is working properly. The people who run the test They're in control rooms separated from the engine. And the reason that they're in control rooms away from the engine itself is just in case there was a mistake in the assembly of the engine. Because if you hook up an engine to high temperature, high pressure equipment and it's not put together properly, it can blow up, it can catch on fire. And so you make sure that the people that are controlling the test are away from where the engine is. Now, the proper way to get from test cell 1, imagine that's the one on the left, to test cell 2, that's the one on the right. The proper way to get from one to the other is to walk out a door, down a set of stairs, around the outside of the building, up a set of stairs, and back in. But there happened to be a room that held all of the high temperature and high pressure equipment needed to run the test. And that room spanned both buildings. And there was a door on either side, one in test cell 1 and one in test cell 2. It was there just for ease of access of the maintenance team. It wasn't supposed to be used for anything else. And there was a very large sign on the doors. The sign said, "Do not enter while test cell is running, could result in death." The reason the sign was there is because if you were in this space between the buildings with all that high temperature and high pressure equipment and something failed, you probably weren't going to go home. You're probably going to be very seriously injured, if not lose your life. Now, these test cells, they were designed, created, and put into production while I was working at the site. So I guess the question that I have for you is, how long do you think it took before people started to use that corridor as a pass-through to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2, despite the sign on the door, which was yellow, which, as you know, yellow fixes everything in safety, right? So big yellow sign that still people weren't following. I don't know exactly when they stopped following this rule, but I did find out about it on day 3 of production. So we'd only been running these test cells for 3 days before I found people were using that as a pass-through. And so here's the question. What should we do about it? It's a real rule with real consequences. And I want to tell you what I did do. And I also want to tell you what I wished I had done and why. Because what I did do is the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to interlock the doors. I wanted to lock them, but even more so than lock them, I wanted it to work the way a microwave door worked. So that if you opened that door, it would shut everything down so that you weren't exposed to the hazard. And it turns out that I'm not alone in that thought process. I've asked a lot of people what they would do in this situation, and these are the most common responses. Most of us think that we should probably interlock the doors or lock the doors. Some people think, hey, maybe make a safer path. Others are thinking, well, maybe we need to explain the rule, explain why the rule exists. Some people think we should observe and coach, correct and discipline. And a few people think, hey, maybe we should ask more why people are doing it. I was of the belief that the right thing to do was to interlock the doors. So I went to go ask permission from my leader to get an engineer to draw up that design. And he laughed at me. And the reason he laughed at me is what I didn't understand is that these test cells are regulated by a regulatory body that has to approve any change in the design. And something as dramatic as interrupting a test in the middle of the test would have to be reapproved by this governing body. And that represented millions and millions of dollars of testing and loss. And so my leader at the time said, I'm not going to spend millions of dollars because people can't follow this simple rule. I need you to go do something else. So I went back to the drawing board and I tried something else. My next thought of what to do was that maybe I should explain the rule, like why the rule existed. So I put together what I thought was a great presentation about the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment to deliver to the people that run this test. And I guess the question I have to ask myself is, what problem did I think I was solving if I believed the solution was a presentation about the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment? And I'm pretty sure, I guess I thought people didn't know, meaning that the only way that I could think that's going to solve the problem is if I believe the problem is people don't understand the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment. Now, to give you a little bit more context, the people who worked in this area, many of them had been working with testing jet engines for longer than I had been alive at that point in time. And so that was actually a pretty large assumption that they didn't understand. But I guess I got that assumption just from seeing people use this as a pass-through, right? If they're not going to follow the rule, my assumption is that they must not understand the rule. So I went and I delivered this presentation and I shook everyone's hand afterwards. And I said, I care about your safety. I know you care about your safety. And now we know that we shouldn't be using this as a pass-through anymore. And I walked out thinking I had solved the problem. As you can guess, I hadn't. It didn't change. That presentation didn't change whether or not people were using the corridor as a pass-through. What it did change actually was their opinion of me. Because in explaining concepts that they already understood, I had inadvertently talked down to them. I had inadvertently conducted myself in a way that made it hard for people to want to interact with me. Because I had told experts in their own field some basics about something they already knew. So I found out they were still using this as a corridor, even though I'd given this presentation about the dangers of high temperature and high pressure equipment. And so I went back to my leadership team and I said, well, what do you want me to do now? I explained the why of the rule. It didn't change anything. And they said that probably we needed to make people understand that we were serious about the rule and it wasn't negotiable. And so they suggested that we do disciplinary action. So start with a coaching conversation and then, have a verbal warning and then a written warning and make people understand that this rule is non-negotiable. So I did that with the supervisor. And I got to a written warning with one of the people in this area. And from then on, I didn't see anyone using it as a pass-through. So I'm feeling good. I feel like I've solved the problem. And it's not until 3 months later that I realized I hadn't solved the problem at all. Because every week I had been doing audits to check to make sure people were using this corridor or not using this corridor. And after the disciplinary action, my audits looked great. They were always green. And I went at a different time every day, every week to audit what was happening. And so I was pretty confident that I had changed this behavior through disciplinary action. And then about 3 months later, I got really busy and I wasn't able to complete my audit one week. And so I asked a new intern to do it for me. And I gave him the audit sheet. And the very first thing I noticed when he came back is that in a 15-minute period of time, he had seen 3 people use that corridor as a pass-through. And I realized that I hadn't fixed the problem. I had modified behavior, but the behavior I modified wasn't the use of the corridor. The behavior I had modified was whether or not people did it in front of me. And what I learned later, because they told me, is that they actually had a 15-minute warning that I was coming, because it took me about 15 minutes to walk across the yard to get to these buildings. And so when I was standing there, people just didn't use it as a pass-through. And then as soon as I walked away, people went back to doing what they thought was the right thing to do anyway. I had inadvertently created something called a compliance mentality. A compliance mentality is when people do what you want them to do in front of you, but as soon as you walk away, they go back to doing what they thought was right to begin with. But in real life, when I got this audit sheet back, I have to tell you, I was upset. I was embarrassed. I was frustrated. Because what it meant is that every time for 3 months that I had gone to go into that area, people had been lying to me. Right? They had been pretending in front of me. So I went back to the leadership team and I asked them what they wanted me to do next, right? I had tried to get permission to interlock the doors. I had been told no. I tried to explain the why of the rule and people didn't listen to it. I used progressive discipline and people still did what they wanted when I wasn't there. And so I went back and I said, what are we supposed to do? Can I please just lock the doors? Can I do a regular lock and key? Can I lock the doors? And they said, yeah, you could do like a regular lock on the door. That won't affect the test. Sure. Regular lock and key on the door handle would be fine. And I hate to admit how we talked about putting in the lock, but at the time we said things like, you can't fix stupid, can you? If they're going to act like children, treat them like children. Lock the doors. So I put in a work order and I got a lock on the door. And I went to go make sure that it was in place. So the lock's on the door handle, it works. And I'm about to walk away when I noticed there was a key over the door ledge. So I took the key away because nobody really has to be in here besides maintenance. So maintenance should be the only people with the key. So I took it away and I came back later that day to see what happens when you take the key away. I really expected another key to be there. There wasn't, so no key. The door's locked and I'm about to walk away when I pulled on the door. And in pulling on the door, it flew open because they had put tape on the inside of the door to prevent the door from locking. And it's at this point in time that I actually finally asked a question. Because up until this point, I had made a lot of assumptions and made a lot of decisions without actually having learned anything. And it's at this point in time that I finally asked why. But to be honest with you, I didn't do it well. In this scenario, I actually asked why out of frustration. And I walked into the control room and I said, would somebody please tell me why you keep using this door as a pass-through? You could die. In this hop space, we take a lot of time to teach people how to have conversation in a way that people can be honest with you, that they can be candid with you. And walking into a room and yelling at people is not the way to do it. But I got very lucky that there was a 30-year veteran in that room. So somebody who'd been doing that work for 30 years. And if I was willing to ask the question, he was willing to answer it. And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, Andy, it's because your rule is stupid. And this is when I think I actually started to understand some of these HOP concepts, because instead of getting frustrated with that, I said, tell me more. And by asking that question, I learned more in about 5 minutes than I had learned in the 5 months before this as to what was going on. And he looked at me and he said, Andy, what you probably don't understand is we don't use this pass through while the engine is at full power. We only use it while the engine is idling at its lowest power. So for translation, that means everything's running at lower temperature, lower pressure. Bit of a risk assessment done. But still at low temperature, low pressure, you could be seriously injured if anything failed, right? If any of that equipment failed. And so I explained that much. And he looked back at me and he said, well, Andy, then probably what you don't remember is that part of the quality checks we have to do on this engine, we have to go into the test cell and stand next to the engine while it's at its lowest power. With the same temperature and pressure equipment you're so concerned about up here, but don't seem concerned about in the actual test itself. And then he said, and we have to do that for about 20 to 30 minutes. And it only takes us 15 seconds at most to walk through this corridor. And then he said, and when you all were designing this thing, we asked you for cameras to be put into the test cell. And you all told us it was too expensive to figure out how to do it. And then he said, and when you put these new test cells in, you decided that the technology was good enough that you only needed one team of people to run both of them. But you didn't give us a fast enough way to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2 to actually run both of them simultaneously. Or did you not know that either? That was probably the biggest piece of humble pie I've ever eaten. Because I realized in that moment that I had made a whole lot of assumptions. And honestly, I had never even asked why. I had never, it didn't cross my mind to ask people why they were using that as a pass-through. It didn't even cross my mind. And I don't know if you know this, but it's very hard to do something that doesn't cross your mind. And if I could do it all over again, I would have started off with just asking. I would have started off with saying, hey, I noticed we're using this as a pass-through. Can you teach me why that makes sense to do? But I didn't do that, in part because I had been indoctrinated into something called Taylorism. If you haven't heard of Taylorism, Taylorism, by its slang term, is an ism like ageism, like racism, like sexism. But it's the ism between those of us that plan and manage work and those of us that execute the work. It's the improper belief that the people who plan and manage work are smarter than the people who are executing the work. Now, if you Google Taylorism, what you'll find is that by definition, it refers to a paper written by Frederick Winslow Taylor in 1911. And it's also the very first tick on a timeline of the history of management. That paper is still taught in business school today, and it's considered the most influential paper in business for the entire century. The reason it's so influential is because it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that it was written. And it was helping explain, how do you go from having a master craftsman to a model of mass production, and what looks differently? And the beginning of the idea of assembly line work was written into this paper, right? You should teach somebody how to do a small portion of something and then pass it on to somebody else who's taught how to do a different small portion of something. Frederick Taylor was one of the first people to write that idea down. But he also had a very, very, very low opinion of the worker, because it reflected the classism that existed at the time. And he wrote things like, the worker does not have the mental capacity that the planner has. He said he could teach an intelligent gorilla how to do some of the work better than some of the people that he had interacted with. The examples that he used, it was as though he pictured himself as a puppet master, where he could tell people partial truths and trick them into being more efficient. He also coined a term called soldiering, which meant that people were going to do the bare minimum at work, but they would look busy, so you'd have to time them and watch them. This set up a dynamic in many industries of a parent-child relationship between those of us that plan and manage work and those of us that execute the work. Where people who are planning and managing work, we have been pushed into the parent ego position, and the people who are executing the work have been pushed into the child ego position. And I didn't know it at the time, but I actually had already been indoctrinated into that thought process. So when I see someone not following a rule, I'm picturing it as though I'm in the parent ego position. And my job is to make sure they understand the rule. And if they can't follow the rule, it's to discipline. And if they don't listen to the discipline, well, I'm going to lock them out of the room in the same way you might treat a child. And this is where the idea of accountability comes into the discussion. Because a lot of the confusion that we have around accountability has to do with how we're defining it and how we think we achieve it. In my world, we very much confused the concepts of accountability, discipline, and consequence. And accountability is, it's a very difficult word because it doesn't translate well from language to language. And actually, depending upon your mother tongue, accountability has many different meanings. To hold someone accountable, that term actually comes from the US legal system. The belief was if somebody didn't take responsibility for their actions, you should bring them to court to hold them accountable so that they did feel responsible by doing something to them, taking away freedom, taking away money, something. And in my world, in my business, when people said we need to hold the person accountable, they really meant we needed to use some sort of HR disciplinary action, or we needed to create consequence because that person should know they were wrong. But that definition of accountability isn't very helpful in an organization. There's another definition that is, because I can tell you in HOP, we want and need accountability. But we want and need accountability by a definition that is incredibly useful in an organization. And that might be the definition you're using already. I don't know. It depends upon your business. It depends upon what country you are in. But a great definition of accountability is that it's someone's willingness to accept responsibility for their actions and to account for them or to tell the story of their actions. Meaning that people aren't deflecting when you ask them what's happening. People are taking responsibility and ownership for what they're doing, and they explain their thought process to you. When you have a group of people that embody that at work, it's fantastic. It's very helpful. And so it is also helpful to know how you can create an environment of accountability. Because the most important part of this definition is it's someone's own willingness to accept responsibility. It's intrinsic to someone. In a given situation, a person either feels accountable or they don't. And there's two really big buckets of what allows someone to feel accountable. The first is who they are, some combination of nature and nurture, and we don't have a lot of control over that. Some people see themselves as a victim of their environment, and other people feel as though they have agency. We try to hire people that don't feel like they have no agency, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. We don't have control over who somebody is. But what's interesting is there's another huge category of what goes into whether or not someone can feel accountable. And that has to do with the environment that they're in. And that environment can eclipse whether or not the person feels accountable personally. Meaning, you can take a person who is highly accountable, highly responsible in their personal life, and put them in an environment in which they don't feel or act that way at all. And there are low accountability environments and high accountability environments. In the HOP space, we are driven to create high accountability environments. But I want to describe both of them to you so that you can picture them, because I think we've all experienced both of them. A low accountability environment is this. If you walk into work in a low accountability environment, the feeling you get is that you're a cog in a wheel. You're a number. You're replaceable. Things are done to you, not with you. Your expertise is not sought after. You are most often in the child ego position, meaning people are talking down to you, like I did to the employees, telling you what you should and shouldn't do. People are far more interested in your compliance than they are in your thoughts. And knowing your name is usually a bad thing. In that environment, it's actually really hard for anyone to feel accountable, because you can't feel responsible for your actions if you don't believe your actions are your own to take. If you don't feel like you have agency, you can't feel accountable. And you can hear it. It's not a mystery. You can hear it in how people talk to each other. In low accountability environments, people say things like, "That's not my job. Don't look at me. I was just doing what the procedure said." Or, "Yeah, talk to my boss about that." If you're trying to engage someone in a meeting, they're sitting like this. Those are all indications that we have a low accountability environment. Now, in any group of people, there are some people that are going to be apathetic to their job. That's not what I mean. There's going to be a small group of people apathetic to their job. But if you have a large group of people acting this way, that's not a function of the people that we're hiring. That's a function of the environment that we've put them in. You can also picture a high accountability environment, one in which when you come into work, you do feel valued. You know you have expertise and people call upon that. If you left your job, people would have to fill your position, and they tell you that all the time, that they would miss you if you were gone. You're in adult-adult relationships. People talk to you as an equal. You're not in that parent-child dynamic. And somebody knowing your name is a good thing. That's a high accountability environment. And in the HOP space, we're working really hard to create high accountability environments by how we talk to each other and how we allow people to teach us what the reality of their work is. This doesn't mean we don't use HR disciplinary action, but we only use it when we actually have a person problem. At work, we have system problems and person problems. Person problems are a hiring mistake. Person problems are very small percentages, but they exist. They're the people that we hired that we wish, man, I don't really want you to be working here. And we know the difference because person problems follow the person around. It doesn't matter where you put the person, the problems follow them. It's things like bullying, things like not being able to be a functional member on a team, things like micromanaging everyone else around you, things like being out on a field team and other people being concerned that you're working with them because you're not listening to anyone around you and you take action without communicating. There are person problems in our organization. HR disciplinary action is a fair way to give that person a chance to change before we ask them to leave. The nice thing about person problems, though, is that you already know who they are by first and last name. They are not a mystery in an organization. And most person problems, unfortunately, have nicknames. These are the people that when they are finally removed from the organization, everyone says, thank goodness. Right? These are the people that if you remove them, you'd rather there be a hole in your organization than have that person there. They're not the same thing as system problems. Person problems, they're hiring mistakes. They don't just pop up when an event occurs. They're there all the time because it's intrinsic to the person. We don't really want to have an event needed, a safety issue or a quality issue to fix it or deal with it. They do require coaching, setting expectations, reassignment, disciplinary action, removal. And the problem goes away when they do. That is a really small percentage of what we deal with. Most of the time, we're dealing with system problems. System problems require learning and improving. They can be uncovered before or after events. Unfortunately, they often look like person problems on the surface, even though they're not. They can't be solved with discipline. Disciplinary action doesn't fix it. And the problem does not go away if you try to remove a person. I had confused my world believing I had person problems when really I had system problems. And those system problems needed system level fixes. We needed a safe way for people to get back and forth between those two areas. And we needed a way for people to observe that test without having to stand next to high temperature and high pressure equipment. Those were the real problem statements. Those were the system level fixes that we needed to put in place, which we did. But it took me 5 months to be able to figure out the difference between a system problem and a person problem because I was so deeply indoctrinated into this Tayloristic mindset of parent-child relationship. And if I could do it all over again, instead I was switched to an adult-adult interaction. And I would learn from the people. I'd see the behavior, and instead of telling them what they need to do differently, as though I was the parent and they were the child, I would say, hey, could you help me understand what's going on here? Because I see a sign, but I see you using this door, and I know you know a lot about this area, and I'm just not understanding. Can you teach me, please? From there, you can learn system problems. Hope that helps. I want to leave at least the last minutes that we have together for questions. I just want to let you know we absolutely want and need accountability. It's just disciplinary action isn't the pathway to get there. They're two different concepts. What are you thinking? Thoughts, questions?
Nós temos uma
Yes, we have a
série
lot of
de
questions here.
nós temos uma série de perguntas aqui. Ah, primeiro,
All right.
primeiro eu
Let's
preciso
go.
saber. Então, você está ouvindo? Aí eu ia perguntar se você estava ouvindo a tradução. Então, você já está. Andrea, fantástico. A gente tem aqui algumas perguntas. E uma curiosidade que veio aqui foi o seguinte: quais foram as ações que você tomou depois dessa história que você nos contou? Como é que você fez depois disso para aplicar os princípios do
Would
HOP
appreciate.
nessa
Yeah,
organização?
brilliant question. So the first thing that we did was I actually brought people together and we had adult conversation, and they taught me what they were actually dealing with without me standing there and yelling at people. And from there, we defined the real problems they were facing. The real problems were the fact that the hazard I was concerned about was actually incorporated into the test itself. And so what they had wanted in terms of cameras, it had been turned down originally, not because the camera itself was expensive. Their explanation of what they were concerned about and our recognition that if we're concerned about it in this corridor, we should absolutely be concerned about it in the test itself. We spent 3 years researching and testing out cameras to try to prove that we could find one. To be honest with you, I left the site on the 3rd year. We were testing out infrared cameras. I don't know if they use them, and I'm afraid to ask because I really want it to be like a positive that they found a camera, but I don't know. In reality, I don't. The thing that was very achievable and fixable was being able to find a way to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2 in a safe way. And what the team suggested, the people who worked there, is that we guard the inside of the corridor so that if any of the high temperature or high pressure equipment failed, you would be protected. But it would allow them to use that corridor as a pathway to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2. So you could take the thing that felt natural and like the right thing to do, and you could make it the safe way to do it. And that's what we did. We guarded that. So those were the 2 things that we worked on. One which was easy, one which took 3 years, and I still don't know the outcome. I could call and ask. I know people that work there.
Fazer
Joia,
a
legal.
segunda aqui, Juval.
Lê aí.
Vou falar em inglês porque escreveram em inglês aqui, mas
Sure.
primeiro eu queria falar sobre as câmeras, né? As empresas têm muito essa mania de colocar câmera achando que vai evitar acidentes, quando na verdade ela só te dá um ingresso VIP ali para enxergar. Entendo que se for para tentar entender o que aconteceu ali de verdade, tudo bem. Agora, para policiar, não vejo muito sentido. Mas, Andrea, how do you tell a manager that he or she is creating a low accountability environment by his or her actions?
Say that again. Sorry.
So
So
how
just
do
to
you
be
tell?
to clarify, by the way, the cameras in this circumstance were designed to look for leaks on an engine, oil leaks, so that you physically didn't have to be next to the engine. Just to clarify the
Oh
use.
yeah, no, not in this case, but here, not. I don't know if it's only here, but everywhere.
No,
people
it's everywhere.
cameras
What you're
have-
saying is everywhere. Yeah.
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 But the question is, how do you tell a manager that she or he is creating a low accountability environment by her actions or his actions?
It's a great question. And if you're someone who is outside of the organization, you can do that directly. When you're in an organization, it's hard, right? Especially if that person is in your own structure and has control over your livelihood. In my world, when I was within my own organization, I spent less time trying to convince people that they were creating low accountability environments and more time trying to create a high accountability environment around me and others so that we could learn the same information. Because you're right to think it is incredibly difficult if you are in your own organization to tell someone that you work with or that you work for that they are creating a low accountability environment. You can show them what different looks like. And if they're curious, you can then explain what you're doing differently. And if you have somebody else externally come in, they oftentimes can say messages because they don't work there, right? That are much harsher and more direct than when you're in your own organization. I wish I had a better answer. I don't.
A clear answer.
Legal. Posso colocar mais um aqui, Hugo?
Vai lá, Gilval.
Vamos lá. Então, pegando carona, Andrea, nessa resposta, então vem outra pergunta, né, muito interessante. Quais são os maiores desafios enfrentados nesse processo de transformação, né? Numa organização que tradicionalmente opera sob uma abordagem mais punitiva?
It's a great question. All of it's hard. I think the thing that brings me hope is in that in any group of people in an organization, you can find individuals who are aligned with this thought process and can see the negative ramifications of a punitive culture. And so because it's all hard and because you can't force anyone to think differently, what I've found over the years of doing this that seems to be effective is instead of trying to convince everyone, you find the people that this makes sense to, and you work together to influence how you learn about things, to influence the design of something, because it is very, very difficult to change an entrenched belief system. And depending upon what country you're in, depending upon the family structure you grew up in, all of that plays a part in how you hear this message, right? If you grow up in a very hierarchical family or a structure in a country that's very top down, it feels as though that's the only option to create some amount of control. And you're asking people to change 20, 30, 40 years of belief system in a conversation. And that is oftentimes not realistic. What is realistic is finding people whose thought process enables them to see this and then proving it to others by doing it, right? By showing system weaknesses, by learning more about a process, by even if there is a punitive aspect to something, going on your own accord and learning about what's happening and then being able to tease out those real problem statements. Because I was able to go back to my own team, the ones that said, discipline them, and say, I think we have different problems here. The problems are, and then define the real problems. And when you give people real information, they listen. Yeah, they listen well.
Fantástico, Andrea. Fantástico. É um desafio enorme. Vai lá, Hugo, traz mais um. Deixa eu perguntar uma coisa para ela primeiro. Já vai dar aqui 10 horas no Brasil, deve ser 9 horas onde você está, não é, Andrea? Deve ser 9. Me diz uma coisa, quanto tempo mais você tem?
We can hang out longer if people want to. I'm okay with that.
Você é maravilhosa, obrigado.
Acho que a gente pode fechar em 15 minutos. Pode ser 15 minutos, André? Acho que é bom, senão a gente vai até amanhã aqui. Só para respeitar o tempo dela.
Sounds good to me.
15 minutes.
I can talk about this subject forever. So as long as people want. My husband might be upset that I don't come downstairs, though. So we'll give him 15 minutes and then.
Ok.
Ok. Próxima pergunta. No exemplo que você compartilhou, foi aplicada alguma técnica de learning team? Foi feito um learning team para chegar às ações que vocês chegaram?
Great question. At the time that this event happened, learning teams didn't even exist yet. So this was the beginning of what learning teams probably look like today. The idea of operational learning is sort of the foundation of what a learning team is. That term didn't exist either. But what it is learning from the end user about what it actually takes to get work done. And in the moment of me realizing I had completely made up assumptions about what the problems were and compartmentalized information improperly. It was in that moment. It wasn't anything special. I just asked a few more people to come together and I said, I think I've been wrong here. And if you're willing to teach me what I'm missing, I'm willing to listen. So can you tell me more? What I'm hearing is that it's hard to get from one side to the other. And then they taught me the details of like what part of the test they couldn't get fast enough from one to the other, right? Of the fact that they did have to spend the 20 to 30 minutes in the test cell. So I guess you'd call it a learning team today.
Yes,
It didn't exist yet.
agreed. Sua vez, Juval.
Vamos lá, para a gente. É uma curiosidade enorme. Andrea, como é que você se deparou com o hop? Conta para a gente como foi esse momento.
Oh, that's a great question. I had been taught multiple versions of human performance because I came from the aviation industry. So as you probably know the history, right? Human performance was born out of the nuclear industry and applied to the aviation industry. And I wasn't sure that I understood human performance because the way that it was taught to me was just a series of tools that I had to go implement for people. And then at one point in time, my boss told me that there was a guest speaker coming and he was going to talk about human performance. And I said, no, thank you. I don't want to go. I've already heard a bunch about it. And they said, well, he's really entertaining. You might want to hear it again. And Todd Conklin, Dr. Todd Conklin, as you guys, I'm sure you know him, came in and spoke at our organization. And man, it was the first time that any of it made sense to me. I just started to think, those are the missing puzzle pieces, but I wanted to know where they came from. So I asked a bunch of questions of like, where was the information coming from, and learned that it's this interesting combination between organizational psychology, systems thinking, systems design, and complexity science. And so then I just started to dive into those three topics myself because I didn't know what else to do. It wasn't even called HOP yet, right? It was called human performance. And so I just started to learn about those topics and realized that there were so many elements in those areas that we just didn't understand in how we were running our business. Mm-hmm. And so I became passionate about trying to use them, but it didn't have a name. It wasn't like a rollout or a program, or it was just, these are like good things that people should know and we should be using them. And then things have changed, right, over the years. And now it's got a place to live and a name and people who are passionate about it. And that's amazing because then more and more people get to hear about the subject. But yeah, that's how I learned about it. It was still called human performance. And Todd brought this flavor because his background is in organizational psychology, right? And he's brilliant. So he brought this extra understanding to the table that had been left out in many other places that I had been taught the subject.
Legal.
Her career. Oh, lovely. Yeah. 12 years ago. Yeah. Sorry, I just saw in the chat. I know that one.
No, it's the same.
Vai lá, Hugo.
Vou fazer uma pergunta aqui que não apareceu no chat aqui, mas que muita gente tem essa dúvida, né? Que é qual é o caminho mais acurado para conseguir um sponsor aí ou convencer a alta liderança a seguir esse caminho do Human Organizational Performance? Que na verdade é o trabalho que você faz, né, André? Muito bem, melhor do que ninguém, inclusive.
Thank you for that. But there's many people who are very, very good at this. That question, I think, is really dependent upon where someone is in an organization. It is really hard to be a prophet in your own land. I know because I tried for many years and I was able to make some change, but it was slow and it was hard. And I think that a lot of times we spend so much energy trying to convince someone else around us that this is the right thing to do, that we don't always take the time to do what's in our own control to change. And so I guess my thought would be that I would encourage people to try to balance that, because there's actually quite a bit in each of our own roles that we can do that aligns in this hop space, that we don't really need to convince anyone else that it's a good thing to do. We can do it. And then when it brings different results, people become interested in why it was different. And then that gives you a space to teach about why it's different. It's really hard to just go out and sit down in a meeting with a senior leader and say, this is what we should go do differently. Some people can do it. And if you can, fantastic, right? Like if you have that ability and you have the ear of that person and they're in a space to want to learn, that's amazing. Use it. But what all of us do have the ability to do is to look at our own sphere of control, to understand these concepts and to adjust what we actually have some control over in order to make change. And when you do that, you end up influencing somebody around you to do it. And then they want to learn, and then they influence somebody else, and then they influence somebody else. And then suddenly, like, people are curious as to why your facility or your group is functioning differently. And then someone somewhere else is asking. And then that's a beautiful space to be able to explain it. Yeah, I don't know if that's useful or not, but that's the way it has worked in many organizations to try to make change little by little.
Muito bem. Obrigado, Andrea. Eu tenho uma pergunta, já que o Hugo fez uma pergunta dele, eu vou fazer uma pergunta minha também agora. Minha dúvida é o seguinte, como é que você está vendo, Andrea, com essa evolução de Hop e Learning Teams, como é que você está vendo as empresas fazendo acontecer a aprendizagem organizacional? Porque, e todo brasileiro faz uma pergunta e depois faz um porquê, tá? É um defeito nosso. Então, por que é necessário transformar isso em lições aprendidas? Como é que as empresas estão fazendo que uma unidade no lugar do mundo aprenda com o Learning Teams de uma unidade do outro mundo? Como é que está acontecendo esse aprendizado organizacional?
So is the question, how are people integrating HOP concepts into how their business is functioning, into their management systems?
Sim, mas principalmente como é que o conhecimento fruto dos Learning Teams estão sendo passados para os vários lugares da empresa.
Great question. So the organizations that tend to do this really well are ones that have tiered approaches to how they pass information within the organization. And so that structure exists in some organizations already, and it's used for continuous improvement. It's used for quality issues. It's used for safety issues. That tiered structure, if also used for learnings from HOP, is really, really helpful. Companies that don't have that structure, I mean, honestly, probably need to create one, meaning that there's information flow and pathways that have to be intentionally created in an organization. And oftentimes without that intent, it feels very haphazard, right? So there isn't a structure to pass information. And so people just try to pass it from one group to another without a good flow of that information. So the structure has to be there to pass information, but then also what you're choosing to communicate becomes important. And part of what is really helpful about operational learning is the problem definition.
Uhum.
We learn to define problems, and then we brainstorm solutions to those problems. And those problem statements are actually these really beautiful pieces that can be communicated quite quickly. Oftentimes in organizations, we tell very long, complex stories about a specific event or a specific failure, and we get lost in the story itself. The story is important. The story is important for changing culture. The story is important for understanding context. The story is important, but the story might not be the best mechanism for passing lessons learned. Problem statements that are rich with context specific to the problem, meaning, hey, we found it was difficult to get from test cell 1 to test cell 2 quickly. And so because we found it was difficult, this is a guarding structure that we created to allow for that pathway to exist. The backstory as to how we got there
Uhum.
isn't nearly as important if you're just trying to communicate lessons learned to the rest of the organization. The backstory of how we got there is incredibly important if we're trying to communicate cultural change. So we sort of separate those out and then have to have some sort of communication structure to pass it from group to group.
Uau, fantástico. A sua resposta, Andrea, é
Fornecedora.
fantástica, me surpreendeu muito. Muitos insights aqui. Legal.
Pessoal, nós vamos encaminhando para o final. Queria
Sim,
deixar alguns minutos aqui para a Andrea fazer as considerações finais. Queria agradecer muito a participação de todos vocês, agradecer a Segurança Diferente por ter colocado esse evento, um evento desse nível, de modo gratuito, com tradução simultânea aí. O pessoal está elogiando muito aqui o trabalho da Tati, então obrigado, Tati e Felipe aí pelo trabalho. Agradecer muito a André por ter embarcado nessa nossa loucura, por ter aceitado esse convite. Saiba que pô, o público brasileiro adora você, André. Você é muito benquista por todos nós aqui, pelo seu trabalho, sua simpatia, disponibilidade aí. Eu que tenho o prazer de conhecê-la. Todo mundo também na ICL adora você, gosta muito do seu trabalho. E valeu, pessoal. Queria deixar o Gilval aí para concluir e a Andrea também para finalizar aí com chave de ouro.
muito bem. Eu queria saber da Andrea se ela já veio aqui ao Brasil.
Never, not once. And I've been to so many places, but not your beautiful country.
Ok,
Vamos cuidar
Andrea,
disso.
vamos cuidar disso. A gente precisa de um evento
Have to,
presencial
please.
aqui com você, né? Vamos cuidar disso, tá? Muitíssimo obrigado,
Sounds good.
Andrea. Muitíssimo obrigado. Foi uma honra muito grande. Eu, particularmente, participava dos eventos mensais que você e o Bob organizam, e eu pretendo me organizar, Andrea, para voltar a participar dos eventos mensais, que são muito interessantes, né? É muito legal. Parabéns pelo trabalho que você está fazendo, Andrea, no mundo todo, tá? E eu gostaria de dar uns parabéns especiais aqui para a Tatiana Abreu, que está fazendo um trabalho maravilhoso de tradução. Andrea, fica então aí as suas considerações finais para a gente encerrar.
Thank you. I'm just really honored to be able to be here. The fact that so many people wanted to come together and have this discussion. I had no idea years ago when I was excited about these concepts that there would be so many other people in the world that are also excited about them around the world. And I guess my last bit of thoughts, right, apart from my heartfelt thanks for allowing me to be here, is just that it can feel like it's really hard to change things because it is hard.
Uhum.
but there's so much that each of us can do within our own control. And if we each spend time focusing on that, the amount of change that can happen is magnificent. We can't force anyone around us to think differently. And the more we try to force it, oftentimes the more people dig in. But we do have quite a bit of control over what we do. An organization is just a group of people. There is no the organization. It is just a bunch of people. And if a bunch of us are saying, hey, I want a whole bunch of people start doing it, well, the organization changes, because that's all it is a whole lot of people trying to work together. Thank you so much for having me. It was awesome to be able to spend a little time with people.
Fantástico. E que bom que a gente escolheu você num dia que você está inspirada. Ou você é inspirada assim todos os dias?
Always, every day.
Muito bem, muito bem. Gente,
Bye, bye.
foi um prazer enorme ter esse evento aqui com vocês. Então, até breve, tá? E muito obrigado, pessoal. Tchau.
Não.